Well, when God, who can see your heart, confronts him, he says, it's hard for you to kick against the goads. Essentially, if you were an ox cart driver, you could use a goad or a prick, they called it. It was a long pointy stick to poke that animal in the back, and it would go faster as a result. And if it tried to kick back at you, what would it do? It would hit that pinprick and it would hurt it. Okay, the idea here is when someone plays confident, like Saul does, or like Crick, it's actually hard for them. They're faking it. So they say, you got to keep this in mind. Yeah, that's so that you can make them feel better about what they're doing. These guys have absolutely no confidence in what they're saying, nor should they.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the It Stands Written podcast. My name is Braden, and I'm here with Gavin. We are in our series on creation versus evolution. Today, Gavin is going to take us into DNA and how we were created. And Gavin, you were talking a little bit before this episode about how complex DNA is, and if things that we've talked about already, like irreducible complexity, put the nail in the coffin, this is just going to do that even more so. So we're going to take a few episodes to go over this because it's super complex and in-depth. But Gavin, you taken the time to study this and bring us this information. So if you want to take us into that.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks, Braden. Basically, to give credit where it's due, what we're going to talk about today and in the next couple of episodes is essentially a book report or a summary of a book called Signature in the Cell by Stephen Meyer. And this is one of my favorite books on the topic. In fact, it is my favorite book on the topic. I think the best book ever written on the topic, and I don't know that anyone will ever match it. Stephen Meyer has been featured on the Joe Rogan podcast about a year ago. Recently, he was on with Piers Morgan. He's convinced a lot of people that are, in media that they need to probably have a second look at this whole idea of evolution. And he makes an incredible case. And if you ask him if he's a scientist, I think he'd actually deny it. He'd say, no, I'm a science historian. But I guess if he's a science historian, then that's all that I am. But he's actually one of my favorite guys. So we'll go through this. And the series, we're gonna call this little section, I'm going to call it Not a Chance. We're going to talk about the fact that when people say, well, there's a chance that if you just gave it enough time and enough elements at play that it would produce life. And I'm going to make the case that it actually would not, and that it's the byproduct of creation only. Today's going to be a little bit heavy in the science and not so much about just creation. But what you'll find is even if I'm not talking about God's handiwork in it, you're going to realize that the complexity of what we're describing comes about through agency, through a mind, something creating it. And just by extension, you go, yeah, okay, this makes sense. This fits with biblical creation. So the Bible says in Nehemiah 9:6, thou, even thou, art Lord alone. Thou hast made heaven, the heaven of heavens, with all their host, the earth, and all things that are therein, and thou preservest them all, and the host of heaven. Okay, so he's saying he made everything and everything and everything and everything, and this goes down to the smallest possible scale we can understand.
Right.
And that's what we're going to be looking at here. Richard Dawkins is a sort of famous atheist. He said that biology is the study of complex things that appear to have been designed for a purpose, right? That's his definition of biology. Now, he's correct that they do give that appearance. What he does is he argues that it's merely an appearance and that it's an illusion. But nonetheless, we're on the same page thus far. So what we're going to discuss is something that Stephen Meyer calls the DNA enigma. And the question here he's asking is, what is the origin of DNA information for the first life? So for anybody who's already lost and says, yeah, I don't really understand what DNA is, don't worry, it's on the horizon here. So we have two competing hypotheses, right? We have evolution versus God. And what we have to do is when we're, obviously not present to see something, we have to look back and make an inference to the best explanation. So you have different ways you can describe an event. You weren't there, you make an inference to the best explanation. And that's kind of the logic that's used by even Charles Darwin. And he actually said, reason ought to conquer imagination. Now, it's easy to say something like that, but it's another thing to actually be obedient to it. And this is a guy who had a great idea, but never followed it himself.
Right.
Okay, reason did not conquer imagination when it came to him. One of the smartest men, I think, in the world that I'm aware of is a guy named William Dembski. William Dembski is a mathematician. He's part of the Discovery Institute. I think he's a little bit lower on the totem pole now because he's doing entrepreneurial work in the last couple of years. But Dembski wrote a book called The Design Inference, and The Design Inference was published on Cambridge Press. I believe this was actually his dissertation. And in it, he was able to help us sort of get a little bit farther than we have mathematically in years past to figure out how events occurred if you weren't there to actually see them. And his work is pretty amazing, but it's also very complex. And we'll kind of unpack his explanatory filter towards the end of this to explain how this works. because he's such a smart guy, and I don't mean this as in any disrespect to Stephen Meyer. I think Stephen Meyer might be the closest second I've ever seen. He's actually the one who helped me understand what William was talking about. Okay, and that's the guy who we're going to look at. So, not look at, but rather his work that we'll look at. So we've talked before in this podcast about space, time, and matter. We've talked about energy, all right? But what we haven't talked about yet is this sort of fifth, if you will, I don't know what to call it, element thing. It's information. So if I said, Braden, what's information? Pretty hard to define.
Right.
You might be able to give me a lot of examples. I could say just true or false. Text is information. True.
Yeah.
Okay. What about speech?
Yeah.
It qualifies too, right? What if I use this kind of an old-fashioned example? A fax. I take a sheet of paper. Mm-hmm. I scan it. The information transmits across a telephone line, right? And it ends up in another fax machine where it's then printed. Okay. So the paper didn't move, but maybe, its own length, but the information did.
Right.
And so information is sort of this thing it's kind of hard to describe. It can be sent, it can be received, and it can be protected, and oftentimes is, right? The unauthorized reproduction or distribution of this copyrighted work is illegal. Criminal copyright infringement is investigated by federal law enforcement agencies and is punishable by up to 5 years in prison and a fine of $250,000. So it's a real thing, like time and energy and all these kinds of things. It's actually something. The thing is, it's very hard to define. One of the problems isn't just that it takes different forms, but that it doesn't weigh anything. Okay, so if I take a compact disc, okay, and it's blank, it weighs about 15 grams. When I add information to it, guess what? It still weighs the same. This is what makes this so hard to define. If I take a couple different mediums, let's say I've got a CD, a DVD, and a Blu-ray, they have the same shape, they have the same mass, but they carry different amounts of information, right? A CD is going to carry plus or minus a gigabyte. A DVD is going to carry about 5 of them, and a Blu-ray is going to be about 25. And it has to do with the minimum pit length on the when a laser actually makes little pits on the surface of it. Depending on how close to one another they are, it can pack more or less information into it, right? So if you think, okay, well, on a Blu-ray, which is not the highest source of information cramming out there by any means, but nonetheless, it's pretty good at compressing that information onto it. 25 gigs is what you can fit onto a 15-gram object. Our DNA is able to store about 700,000 gigs in a single gram. Okay, so when we talk about how advanced our technology is and how amazing our information stuff is, it's nothing.
Yeah,
it is nothing compared to what God has designed in the DNA. And actually, it's probably considerably higher than that. We'll talk more about that another time. So information is best defined as the reduction of uncertainty. This is the common denominator between all those various mediums we talked about, right? Mm-hmm. Information uses mathematical probability. The more improbable a sequence of characters or symbols, the more uncertainty is reduced. The more uncertainty reduced, the more information is conveyed. So I'm going to give you guys a very simple kind of example here. We're going to talk about a coin flip. I have heads and tails. I have 2 possibilities, 2 outcomes in this event. And since one of them is heads and the other is tails, whichever one we get, the result has reduced the uncertainty of 1 and 2 different outcomes. Okay, so you'd say there's not a lot of information conveyed here. It's a very small amount. But if I were to roll dice, for example, I have now the reduction of uncertainty is 1 in 6. There were 6 possible outcomes. I have 1. So you can see that the roll of a dice actually reduces more uncertainty than the flip of a coin. Okay. Now, if we take the numbers we're familiar with, here are the Hindu Arabic numerals, 0 through 9. The reduction of uncertainty by selecting any one of those at random is 1 in 10. Okay, so these actually reduce more uncertainty than the roll of a die. Mm-hmm. If we're not being cap sensitive, just to make this simple, the English characters of our alphabet are 1 in 26. So you might say that the letter A or the letter J, they reduce the same amount of uncertainty, but it does so considerably at a higher rate than our numbers do or roll of a die or something like that. So information can be measured by use of probability. So I'm going to use here, guys, just as a 2-digit example, I have the number 73. Okay. How do I calculate the information bearing capacity of that? Well, it's pretty simple. Each placeholder there, the 7 and the 3, have 1 in 10 odds of being what they are. Okay. Which means I could calculate it 1/10 times 1/10 The answer is 1/100th. Or I could say 1/10 to the second power, and the answer is still 1/100th, which means that the number 73, if we count 00 as the first placeholder possibility, we have 100 different possibilities. That's how much information, that's how much uncertainty was reduced by having just those two digits in sequence. A 3-digit example is going to be 1/10 to the third power. That's 1 in 1,000 possibilities. Now, if I take a phone number, right, and a phone number is 10 digits, I've actually reduced the uncertainty by 1 in 10 billion. That's the odds of getting that phone number correct. It's 1 in 10 billion. So I want to give you guys an example, and I believe this actually came from Meyer's book. I think that's where I first heard it. There's a guy in an airplane. He meets this girl. Everything's going pretty well. He's excited. She wants to continue their conversation, so she hands him her phone number on a piece of paper, puts it in his pocket, gets off the plane, and he makes it to the hotel where he decides, I'm going to give this girl a call. I told her I would, and the paper's missing. He can't find it. Okay. And I guess this example goes back before she would have just texted him her number, but let's ignore, today's standards. Okay. And he starts to think about it and goes, okay, I didn't look at the number when she handed it to me. I don't know what number it even started with. He says, but there might be some hope I can figure this out. Okay. Here's what I remember. Her phone number, or here's not what I remember, but here's what I know about her phone number. It would contain 10 digits, and it would use just the sequences, just the characters rather, 0 through 9. So if I just start calling, one at a time, eventually I'm going to get to her phone. Okay. Now, anybody listening to this goes, that's kind of absurd, because if it's 1 in 10 billion odds, how many times is he going to have to try that number before he gets it? Well, if he did it, let's say he could dial as quickly as once per second. Okay. Every second he could put 10 digits in and actually get a connection, get someone to answer, which is impossible. It would still take him 371 years. Okay. So she's been dead, and so is he, 4 or 5 times over.
Right.
Okay. It's totally impossible. So the odds of arriving at this, her number, by the way, was 206-292-0401. Okay. That's a random number I picked out. And the odds of arriving at it randomly are identical to the uncertainty reduced. Okay. So if you look at this and go, yeah, he's ridiculous for feeling that way. If you're an evolutionist, I want you to know that you are more ridiculous than he is. Okay. And I'm not trying to say this so that it hurts. I'm trying to say this that you'll understand, yeah, my odds of actually being the product of a undirected process are far slimmer than it would be for me to actually dial this person's number correctly given the opportunity. It's literally, you'll see there's not a chance.
Right.
Okay. And I'll make that case later. Now let's talk about ignoring case sensitivity of the word dog. It's 3 letters. 1 in 26 to the third power, because there's 26 possible outcomes. The word dog reduces 1 in 17,576 possibilities. A lot of information is conveyed in just those 3 letters of sequence. The word faith, 1 in 11,888,000. See how quickly this builds? That's a 5-letter word. The word Arizona, 7 letters. Now we're in the billions. To get the word Arizona, if you were just to randomly drop pieces of the Scrabble, and try to get this, it would take 8 billion attempts, over 8 billion attempts to get it even once. That's how much information is conveyed. If I take, now let's just say a couple of words. We're not even in a sentence. I'm just going to take these 3 words because they're relevant. The words are combinatorial, sequence, space. Okay. Now we're going to have to use scientific notation, because we have 1 chance in 61 followed by about 36 zeros to get those at random.
Yeah.
Okay. We're going to talk about DNA for a moment. DNA is the molecule that's responsible for holding information that's necessary to produce all the different functions and proteins that exist in our cells and in our body. Okay. DNA uses what's known as a nucleotide base to be its letter or its character. Okay. So we use the letters A and B and C to write, English words. This is going to use chemicals known as adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. Okay. There are only 4 of them, and we just abbreviate them A, T, G, and C. Okay. So if I were to say, reach your hand into a bag, and inside of it, there's these nucleotide bases at random, there's 1 in 4 odds you're going to end up with adenine, thymine, guanine, or cytosine. Okay. 1 in 4. So the information that it reduces is, for every place that it holds, 1 in 4 outcomes. The genetic code is a digital code, and it's calculated the same way as any digital code, English language or otherwise. Same thing works. So if I take, for example, a sequence I have here, this, CAC, CTG, GAC, TGA, GGA, CTC, CTC again. Okay. That was 21 character spaces. Okay. Okay, so the odds of getting the sequence, guys, at random, these small 21 space characters that I gave you, is 1 chance in 4,398,046,511,104. That's the odds. Okay.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of different possibilities that can fit into that sequence space. So here's what we can understand from this. The DNA uses a 4-letter chemical alphabet, ACTG. They are precisely sequenced to store and transmit assembly instructions for proteins, which are essentially machinery that are needed for cellular survival. Okay. It's mathematically identical to information written in written language or computer code. And the precise arrangement conveys the message or the signal in what we call specificity. Okay, if you start changing things, you won't get the outcome you're looking for. The specificity is critical here. Richard Dawkins said that the machine code of the genes is uncannily computer-like. Bill Gates said DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software we've ever created. He actually donated, spent a long time, $1 million, I think it was $1 million even, to either Discovery Institute or something like that, because what he wanted was people who do creation research to simply tell him what they're finding. Because if you can mimic this DNA code, you can make the software work better. Supposedly, that was what he was after.
Yeah.
Richard Dawkins said, apart from differences in jargon, the pages of a molecular biology journal might be interchanged with those of a computer engineering journal. So I'm going to give you some examples here. Molecular biology and computer engineering has similar terminology. For example, gene code, information, transcription, translation, editing enzymes, signal transduction circuitry, feedback loop, information processing system. Now here's where we're going with this, guys. A code requires a programmer. Okay, anybody out there who works and does coding knows that these things don't come about except for a whole lot of work. And specifically, you are the intelligent cause behind it. If you either write a book, you write code, whatever the thing is, you speak. Okay, when we say an intelligent cause, what we mean is by the conscious choice of a rational agent rather than by an undirected process.
Right.
Okay. Francis Crick, who he and Watson kind of, I feel like they eclipsed the lady who actually discovered DNA, they kind of get credit for it. Francis Crick said, biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. Why do they have to constantly keep that in mind? How is that useful? Right? It's nonsense. You have to keep it in mind because it requires some considerable effort to do so.
Right.
For anyone unfamiliar with the term teleological is this: relating to or involving the explanation of phenomena in terms of the purpose they serve rather than the cause by which they arise. Okay, so teleological terminology dealing with design is very common among evolutionists, as it's practically unavoidable. These guys use this terminology all the time. Of course, they hate it, but you'll hear them say, well, in order to, or the purpose of, or the function of, or the reason that, and then they fill in the blank with something in biology. It's like, you're trying to tell me that there's a purpose to this? You're trying to tell me there's a reason behind it? It actually exists because, it has, in order to do something? Yeah, that's exactly what you guys are saying.
Right.
So when Crick says, you got to remind yourselves constantly, this came from nothing. Okay, Francis, good luck. In Acts 26:14, God said, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. Okay, the goads are the pricks. Basically, this is a miniature parable where an ox cart, driven apparently by Jesus, is being pulled by Saul. Okay, and Saul is a guy who, if you've read any of the preceding chapters, is an arrogant Pharisee. This is a guy who thinks he's got it all figured out, and by all appearances, he does. Okay, and this guy literally stands over a guy who's being stoned to death for his Christian faith, and people drop their coats right at Saul's feet because he apparently gave hearty approval to this event. Well, when God, who can see your heart, confronts him, he says, it's hard for you to kick against the goads. Essentially, if you were an ox cart driver, you could use a goad or a prick, they called it. It was a long, pointy stick to poke that animal in the back, and it would go faster as a result. And if it tried to kick back at you, what would it do? It would hit that pinprick and it would hurt it. Okay, the idea here is when someone plays confident, like Saul does, or like Crick, it's actually hard for them. They're faking it. So they say, you got to keep this in mind. Yeah, that's so that you can make them feel better about what they're doing. These guys have absolutely no confidence in what they're saying, nor should they.
Right.
Getting back to an earlier topic, Crick has been exposed for his racism. Okay, stripped of his academic titles in 2019 for real racism, including revoking his honorary titles of Chancellor Emeritus, Oliver R. Grace Professor Emeritus, and Honorary Trustee. Let's look at a little bit of what this guy has said. He said there's a difference on the average between blacks and whites on IQ tests. I would say the difference is it's genetic. That was his comment. In 2007, Watson created a furor after he was quoted saying he was inherently gloomy about the prospect of Africa because all our social policies are based on the fact that their intelligence is the same as ours, whereas all that testing says not really. Watson acknowledged that such views were a hot potato, but said that he hoped, while everyone was equal, unfortunately, people who have to deal with black employees find this just isn't true. Well, actually, some people have black employees where that actually isn't the case at all. You got good guys, you got bad guys in every color, right? He's using, essentially like what he calls some kind of a probability to make this case. The fact is, behavior is not found in the genome. Okay, there is no code out there that makes you gay. There's no code out. That's a myth, by the way. If you've been told that, it's not true. There's no genome out there that says that, you're going to be straight. There's no genome out there that says that you're going to have a good attitude or a bad attitude. That's nonsense. It is not found in the genome. Mm-hmm. All it does is code for proteins and operating system. That's it. Doesn't have anything to do with your behavior. You'd think Crick would know that. The subject of this presentation deals with non-living material coming to life, by the way. So if I said, okay, we're talking about the origin of DNA, first life, where did it come from? This would be organic evolution. Okay, if you guys go back to the first episode, I said, hey, anytime someone talks about evolution, make them define their terms. What category does this fit into? This would be organic evolution. Okay, and of course, organic evolution is of the first 5, which are blind faith. We have never seen this happen. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the question, of course, is the DNA enigma. Origin of the DNA information for the first life. Where did it come from? Well, building a cell in the first place requires assembly instructions. Okay, in DNA or something else. People might say, well, maybe there was something before DNA. Fine. The point is you need assembly instructions that can be stored and transmitted and all that kind of stuff for this to work. The origin of life could not be explained because it couldn't explain the origin of DNA. This is really critical. The reason they've had such a hard time with the origin of life is because it's the DNA, it's the information, whether it was that or some other medium, that they cannot explain the origin of. Defenders of the status quo offer no plausible alternative. Now, little trip through history here, guys. We have different ways of viewing things now than we've ever had. Protoplasmic theory was one of the old theories when we looked at things through a light microscope. Okay, scientists thought that simple cells were just globules of protoplasm that contained some single substance within their walls. Okay, and if you look at things through one of these old microscopes, that might appear to be the case. The thing is, now we've got scanning electron, transmission electron, and over the years these things have changed. When I first started looking at it, the Hitachi S4700 was like the big dog, and since then they've got stuff that goes from instead of 1 million x up to 2.5 million x in 3D. Okay, which if you compare a scanning electron to a transmission, that's one of the biggest things. The scanning electron can actually look at things that are 3D objects, whereas transmission electron, though it's a much higher resolution, can only look at 2-dimensional because you're looking at sliced images, right? And so we can get down to really small things to take a look at it. And by doing so, we can see not just the surface of cells. I'm going to show Braden here because you can see it, a picture of a 3D image. This is a result of scanning electron, and here is transmission electron. This is actually a cross-section of one of those cells. You can see very tightly what the organelles look like, where the nucleus is at, all the things that are moving around in there. Now, when we're talking about the origin of life, there have been a lot of sort of competing theories about where things came from. And one of them was spontaneous generation. Okay, Louis Pasteur, where we get the term pasteurization from. The guy was good for something. He didn't understand anything about the origin of life, but he said that it could come about on its own. And his evidence for this was that he actually was able to isolate a liquid inside of a capsule, heats it up, does a bunch of things to make sure that it's sterile, and then he sits there and stares at it for a couple of days, and lo and behold, bacteria or something like that starts to grow. And he says, oh, there you have it. I had this thing clean. Well, as it turned out, he just had a contaminated jug. That's all there was to it.
Right.
Okay, it's nonsense. It didn't happen.
Right, and even if it did happen, he was the one doing the experiment. So that just proves that it needed a person to create it.
Yes, you say if you got it to work that way, it would be interesting. But you got Miller-Urey. That's the other one that people talk about a lot. Okay, Miller-Urey these guys actually, when they did the experiment, they didn't feel that they got anything that was really worth writing home about. Okay, we've made a huge deal out of this since, but basically it works like this: they heat up, water, which is supposed to simulate our ocean. And the vapors go up in a tube where they're then subjected to a spark. Okay. And that spark is supposed to simulate what lightning would have done. Inside of this, you have a reducing atmosphere. I think we may have actually spoken about this briefly in another episode, but a reducing atmosphere is one that has no oxygen. The problem with this is it's really hard to get life in the absence of oxygen, not only because it needs it to breathe, but on top of that, if you don't have any protection from UV light, whatever you create is going to be zapped by the UV rays, and oxygen is the only filter you've got. But if you do have it, you know that the product is going to oxidize, kind of like if you cut open an apple or an avocado and it starts to turn color on you rather quickly. That's actually what Miller and Urey were concerned about. So they said, we've got to get rid of it or it's going to destroy our product. So the point is you can't make life in the presence of oxygen. You can't make it in the absence of oxygen. Mm-hmm. You really can't create life. But these guys were trying to see how they could figure this out. And when they sparked everything, it created this black goopy looking stuff that they could then trap. Now, the reason they had to trap it is because if it went a second time through that circuit, it would actually zap itself again and then destroy the product they just created. Okay, so there's a whole lot of design involved in trying to get this thing to work. What it created was 98% tar and carboxylic acid, which is in fact harmful to the other 2% or so that was amino acids. Okay, so what they produced actually didn't give them any evidence that life could have started this way. Quite the opposite. People said, hey, wait, didn't you just say amino acids? You mean they created amino acids? We're on the path to life because those are necessary for life. Not even close. Okay. But that was the Miller-Urey experiment. Basically, even if you look at the outcome, what they had, some of these products were left-handed, some of them were right-handed. There's kind of like you have a left and a right shoe. You have isomers. Okay. And some of them are going to be capable of being read on the spine of DNA and others can't because they're facing the wrong direction. This was just coin flips odd, 50-50 outcome. That's what they got out of it. And they didn't even produce the number of amino acids that are necessary to create the chain. You need about 20 of them. So lots of problems here. So information, though, going back to this, it requires thought. Information is the result of conscious, intelligent activity. Information theory is the science of information storage, information processing, and information transmission. Okay, so think of this: storage, processing, and transmission. That's what is required here to get this thing to boot. There's a guy named Claude Shannon, okay, and he's the publisher of the Mathematical Theory of Communication. This guy was a information theorist, if you will, information scientist, okay? And he was the one who, I believe, actually said that information is a reduction of uncertainty. Information is also described as communication or reception of knowledge. It's hard to use this description since cellular machinery that receives the instruction set is not a conscious agent, okay? It's not thinking it through. It's just doing what it does because that's the way the chemistry works. The other way to say it is that it's the attribute inherent in and communicated by alternative sequences of something that produces specific effects. Okay. This description doesn't require a conscious agent like a binary code for a computer. Okay. So, fundamental intuition says information is inversely related to uncertainty. Okay. The more information I have, the less uncertainty I have. That's the idea that's why it works through probability.
Right.
Claude quantified amounts of information stored or conveyed across a communication channel, linking the concepts of information and uncertainty to measures of probability. Okay, big warning. Anybody who's laughing at this so far and thinks that it's nonsense, you're going to say, well, Gavin, there's a problem because Shannon information, as they call it, can't distinguish between things that are merely improbable sequences from those conveying a message or producing a specific effect. And they're right. I'm going to give you an example. But don't worry, it's been fixed, and now you're about to learn how. Here's the example. NXPQW. Okay, what are the odds of arriving at this? Well, 1 in 26 to the fifth power. That's 1 in 11,881,376. Okay, here's another sequence of 5 letters. HELLO. Same odds. Okay, what's the difference between them? Well, one is recognizable. One says hello, and one says nothing. The thing is, they both bear the exact same amount of information. And what this is pointing out is that Claude Shannon was able to say, yes, one bears information, so does the other. But there's something about it where he doesn't really kind of bridge the gap between, well, hold on, there's actually more information in that second example than there was in the first. But mathematically, there's not. Okay? William Dembski's going to come to the rescue, don't worry. So the distinction here we need to make is that there is a difference between information carrying capacity. Okay, just imagine Scrabble letters. Okay, and functionally specified information content. Now imagine Scrabble letters lined up to say, I love you. Okay, that particular sequence has content, whereas the previous one had mere capacity.
Right.
Okay. So NXPQW was random. Hello takes advantage of a pre-existing convention or code, in this case, namely the English language, by specificity of arrangement. Okay, it's the specificity and the sequence that they fall in that has this unique attribute. Okay, so I'm going to show you a picture here, Braden. Tell everybody what this picture is.
A bunch of rocks.
It's a bunch of rocks, okay? I want you to look at another picture here. Tell me what that is.
It's a bunch of rocks, but some of them are lined up to look like feet.
Yeah, they're lined up to look like feet. It's still a bunch of rocks, right? And this is the point. Those rocks in the first picture and the rocks in the second are just rocks.
Right.
It's the specific arrangement of them that makes you go, hey, wait, this looks familiar. Okay, whoever did this actually did a great job. You can even see the arch in the foot because they found rocks that made that portion of the foot look legit. Okay, big toe, little toe, all that kind of stuff. So it's the specific arrangement to perform a function that is the distinction between mere Shannon information and functionally specified information. Okay, we're going to stop here for today. Thanks, guys, for listening in, and we'll see you on the next one.
Yeah, listeners, thank you for joining us on this episode of the It Stands Written podcast. And Lord willing, we will see you on the next one.